Good afternoon, and welcome to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council lunch. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation by Abshir Omar, who will speak to us today on U.S. foreign policy. I'm Janet Linus, ICFRC board member and host for today's program. We would like to take a moment to thank our members, our volunteers, and our interns for making these forums possible. Thank you all. So we apologize for the last-minute switch in speakers, but we are delighted to have Abshir Omar joining us today. So at this time, though, I want to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa's Public Policy Center, University of Iowa International Programs, and the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization for their financial support. And I also thank today's special sponsors, Alice and Ken Atkinson, Ellen Swanson, Blank and McCune Realtors, Green State Credit, and Green State Credit Union. I also want to thank City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for telecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2, as well as the U of I Library's digital archives. Please be sure to like City Channel 4 on Facebook. Now, at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Abshir Omar. Abshir Omar has a fascinating past as a refugee from Somalia, now an activist for more inclusive politics, as well as the Iowa political coordinator for a presidential campaign. He went to Iowa State University, where he majored in history, but dabbled in political science as well. He graduated from there in 2015. He is a world traveler, having traveled to more than 40 states and all inhabitable continents except for Latin America and South America. Now with the current presidential campaign he is working on, he is traveling to all the counties in Iowa and goes from everywhere from Des Moines, Iowa City, to the small towns of 200 or less people, and from corner of the state to the next corner of the state, and from river to river, I believe. So now he's working on the political campaign, and we're delighted to have him in Iowa and his willingness to step up and speak to us today about U.S. foreign policy. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Omar.
All right, I'm a little tall, so I don't know if the mic will pick it up or not. Awesome. Well, thank you all for having me here today. I know it's kind of a little bait and switch. You came to see Dr. Zogby, and here I am. So hopefully I won't disappoint. And I haven't really prepared a statement or a speech for you all. But what I want to do is share my personal story of coming to this country and how that intersects with our foreign policy and how that continues in today's global migration crisis, whether it's climate change or terrorism related or economic distress factors. And for me, you know, I don't sound like an immigrant. I don't really have an accent until I get really tired or I had a little too much. But for me, I came to this country in the early 90s. It was a different time in this country. We were more welcoming of immigrants and refugees. My family is from Somalia, where I was born in the early 90s. And the Civil War came about. There was a thriving democracy that was toppled by a dictatorship, and that led way to rebellion and the eventual collapse of the country. And I was born 2 months after my father had died in the Civil War, as millions of others have done so themselves. And at that time in the country, there was no infrastructure. Schools were gutted, hospitals were bombed, there was no running water, no electricity. It was mayhem. And my mother had to give birth to me in her living room with no doctors, no anesthesiologists, and under really difficult circumstances. And after a couple months, my family decided it was time to flee the country. There was no hope, there was no future in sight, and my family got on a bus towards the Kenyan border, leaving Mogadishu, the capital city. And halfway through the journey, our bus pulled over into a ditch. Not into a ditch, but a little rest area. And my mother took off her sandals. I'm about 2 months old at that time, and was walking outside with me in her arms with a couple dozen other people on the bus wanting to get fresh air. And my 3 older siblings were on the bus. Mind you, half of them we had to leave behind in the capital city with our uncles because my mom couldn't take everyone with her. And a couple minutes into that, rebels came out of the bush, started firing at individuals, not with small arms fire, but with anti-aircraft guns and tanks coming into the area. And the bus driver got spooked and closed the door and sped off with my siblings on board. And my mother, having nothing but no shoes on her, had to jump in a ditch with me to seek cover. And there was a firefight, many people died, and after a couple hours, my mother came out of this ditch, and what she saw were bodies strewn everywhere. People, innocent families, having nothing done wrong politically or economically, being killed for who they are, for political gain, for political purposes. And my mother started to walk. She had no options. And a lot of people, would give up at this point. Having your husband die, having your entire country collapse, having all of your resources disappear overnight. And she walked through the desert. Mind you, this is only a couple degrees from the equator, with no shoes. And her feet started to blister and to welt, and she started to have blood coming out of her feet. And you would think that it can only get better. But to her luck, she walked into another rebel encampment. And a soldier approached her with an AK-47. And this soldier's job, his only one job, is to commit genocide, to kill people like my mother and myself, 2 months old at that time. And my mother told me at that moment, she gave up all hope, and she said, "This is my time. I can't fight any longer. I'm done. There's no hope for me." But fate would have it that this soldier had a little bit of humanity still left in him. And when he saw my mother and me, he said I couldn't do it. So instead of shooting her, he took off his army boots and gave it to my mother, and he walked with her for miles, walking her through rebel encampment. And when people asked, "Who is this woman?" he vouched for her, saying, "Oh no, she used to be my neighbor. She's from my tribe." And he took her as far as he could go, and he took his shoes back and he wished her well, right? Had that person not had that little modicum of humanity left in them, I would not be at the stage today talking to you in Iowa. And eventually my family, we were reunited with my siblings, and we had to leave the country, and my mother walked until she got to the line of soldiers with the helmets, blue helmets that said UN. And that is when she said she first breathed for the first time in months. And I spent the first 4.5 years of my life in the Dadaab refugee camp in northern Kenya. Imagine a barren, desolate area with earth that is red in color, right? There's no foliage, there's no running water, there's no infrastructure. And we lived in a tent provided by the UNHRC through donations from charitable individuals around the world, some including here in Iowa. And I had access to health care, right? It was not great, but we had access to health care, but we had no education. And my mother did the only thing she could do at that point. She couldn't go back to her home country, which no longer existed. There was no central government, no services, no sense of safety or security. So she applied to the world, the IOM, International Organization of Migration, and she applied for asylum as a refugee all over the world. She applied to Canada, the United States, Germany, France, England, Spain, many countries. And the first country to respond was Sweden. So luckily she did not accept that offer, otherwise I'd be in Gothenburg speaking Swedish right now. But she got a letter from the United States Embassy saying that the United States would accept her. And a Lutheran church in Seattle was sponsoring our family. People who had no clue who we were, had no connection to us on the other side of the world said that there's a family in distress. We're going to do our part, our moral duty, and extend an olive branch and a hand up. So we got on a flight to Frankfurt, and from Frankfurt we landed in New York. Imagine this little 5-year-old child who's only lived in the deserts of northern Kenya automatically seeing skyscrapers and snow falling in New York. And I remember that experience very vividly. We were in a taxi going to a hotel for the night, and there was a song playing on the radio. Mind you, I don't speak English. I only speak Somali at this point. And I knew I liked the groove. It made me move at that point. And I asked, my mom asked the driver what the song was, and it was the Macarena, right? So from there, we got on a plane and we headed to Seattle, where we resettled. And my family we ended up staying in a shelter for the first couple months that we lived in Seattle, in downtown Seattle at the Yesler Terrace. And my mother, not speaking English that well and not understanding the culture, was able to build a new life for herself, for her children. She worked 2 and 3 jobs. She got us out of that shelter with basic safety nets, and she moved us into the suburbs. And she continued to work hard. And she eventually started a business, and she moved us into one of the nicest suburbs in the city of Seattle, in the Renton Highlands, so that I could get a quality education, because she understood that schools were tied to zip codes, and she wanted me to be able to get the best education I could. And I got a world-class education, right? I came to this country during a time where we welcomed people who didn't look like the mainstream, or we had a foreign policy that was more welcoming, that we didn't, get involved in some of the atrocities that we're getting involved today. And I was able, through basic safety nets, get an education, develop into the person I am today. And now I'm in the position to give back, to help lead the way forward in this country and our foreign policy. So I moved to Iowa. I transferred from my college in Seattle, and I went to Iowa State in Ames. Absolutely hated it, coming from a big city to the small towns of Iowa. But after graduating there, I decided to stay in Des Moines because I happen to like the people here, very welcoming. I happen to like the culture of the state and how it operates. And over the last couple months, I've had the opportunity to do something dramatic. I got a phone call from Senator Sanders' staff stating that he was running for president again, and he was coming to Iowa, and he asked if I could introduce the senator. And I agreed. And I went to the state fairgrounds in Des Moines, and I gave a speech talking about my identity, talking about my history, and why I had a personal affinity and connection with a 77-year-old Jewish guy from Vermont, right? And I had lunch with the senator, and I talked to him about his campaign and what he believed in. And for me, being an immigrant, a Muslim, and a refugee, I cared a lot about foreign policy. And for me, I didn't have a candidate that just talked a good game, but had the history and track record of delivering on justice, social justice for people in this country, but also for people across the world. So I agreed to join his campaign, and he appointed me as his political coordinator here in Iowa. Could you imagine that? The first refugee to serve on senior leadership of any presidential campaign in this country, and it's here in Iowa. So I think that's a great thing. I think it shows where we're headed as a country. So for me, when I look at what's happening in this country today, a lot of people are very worried. They're very concerned about the direction of our domestic policy, but also where we're headed on the international front. And many people are worried. It's not just issues in Latin America or South America. It's not issues just in the Middle East, but new frontiers, Africa, South Asia. And also our alliances in Europe are deteriorating. So a lot of people are concerned, and I think folks like you who are very interested in these issues are very concerned, and you have a lot of questions that we're going to touch upon today. But for me, I look at foreign policy a little differently because I am kind of a cultural chameleon. I'm both American to the core, but I'm also Somali, and I'm a Muslim refugee. And I understand the lives of millions of people around the world who are currently displaced, internally and externally in other countries. We have a crisis on our hands. We have more refugees today than there has ever been in the history of the world. Yet we are the most advanced, we have the most resources. We have had hundreds of years of philosophical debates about morality, about just governance, but yet today we have, in our reality, millions of people who are displaced, who have suffered tremendously because of economic reasons, because of political reasons, and because of religious bigotry. And as the United States, as the most powerful nation on earth, I think we have a moral responsibility to take part in solving these issues, a lot of them having stemmed from our own actions. So for me, I, like our wonderful host said, I travel the world because for me to understand humanity, I have to meet you where you are. So I've traveled to Asia, I've been to South Korea. I have family that live in South China. They do business there, and I go there quite often to Guangzhou. I've been to Malaysia, all over Africa and the Middle East. And in 2011, every one of us saw that there was a revolution happening in Egypt. We were seeing wall-to-wall coverage of what was happening in Tahrir Square. Thousands of young people angry with the conditions in their country, taking to the streets, demonstrating and protesting a brutal dictatorship. And many of us saw that and said, well, that's interesting. Many of us said, this is a hopeful forte to a new bright future. And some of us were a little concerned with what was happening. Me being who I am, I got on a plane and I went to Cairo to see firsthand what was happening there. And I spent a week and a half in Cairo, and I actually went to Tahrir Square and I took part in a protest. And what I saw were young people who did not care about the past, who did not care about the political circumstances of the day, but had only one singular mission, the possibility of tomorrow. They were worried about the future they were going to live in, and they were darn sure that they were going to be part of the process to change it. And, a lot of change around the world doesn't come from the establishment community. It comes from the poor. It comes from the young people who are no longer willing to live under the circumstances that they're in. And I saw these young kids marching around Tahrir Square, shouting down a dictatorship and a military oppression with tanks lined up, pointed at them. These kids were fearless, right? They only cared about freedom and justice, the values we as Americans value and enshrine in our Constitution and talk so eloquently about every midterm and every presidential cycle. But these kids actually put it to the test. They were willing to put their lives on the line for freedom, for hope, for a better life, and for economic prosperity. And during that time, I was staying at my best friend's apartment, who was studying at the American University then. And while I was at his home, power was cut to the building, water was cut. You would hear helicopters circling the city, but the people of Egypt were not deterred, right? Gas shortages were happening, and there were about a mile-long lines to get petrol. But the people were determined to change the fate of their country, and in part start a little revolution in the region of their world for democracy. And I left 3 days before the election happened. I'm a little gutsy, but not that gutsy. So I got on a flight and I left, and I was surprised about what happened, that the people actually were able to change the reality of what they were living under. They toppled a dictatorship. They elected a new government, which is not perfect, but it was a start in the right direction. And I really thought there was hope for the Middle East and for Africa from that moment. And it made me think about our foreign policy and how the United States has played roles in destabilizing countries, in regime changes, and also our incidental policies that affect millions of people across the world. And it brings us to the question about what is U.S. foreign policy? To me, and to millions of people around the world, it's neocolonialism. They see the United States as a force for change, but not in a good way, where we prop up dictatorships around the world because of our regional alliances, where we allow our corporations to abuse the workers of nations, for our iPhones. There are children in China that are working in factories surrounded by safety nets so that they don't jump out the buildings, right? We have so much to do with a lot of suffering around the world, but we have so much potential to change a lot of that suffering and to uplift millions of people around the world, possibly billions. And for me, looking at what's going on around the world, we have hotspots in Africa. Somalia, that was a failed state that caused my status as a refugee, right now has a burgeoning movement of democracy. What are we doing as a country to support the civil society, support the NGOs in helping develop a new government system? Right now in Sudan, I know many of you know there are thousands of Sudanese refugees that live here in Iowa City. And you also elected one of them to your city council, so props to Iowa City. You made that happen. But there's a revolution happening there. where the people have stood up and wanted to overthrow a dictatorship which has caused genocide to millions of people in that region. We have tumult in Libya, where we were part of the overthrow of a government, and now we have a nation that is a bastion for terrorist activity. We have a moral responsibility to be involved in the redevelopment of that country and the protection of its people and its resources. Right now in Syria, we have one of the worst global humanitarian crises happening, where the US and many European nations are involved. And the question is, what are we doing to legitimately solve the crisis of millions of refugees who are leaving Syria, going to Lebanon and to Jordan? And also, we cannot forget about those places in South Asia, in the South Philippines, where separatist movements are coming up, where terrorist activity is rampant, where we have issues in Europe with immigration, with our NATO alliances. And the United States has a moral responsibility to be a good actor in the world, to put our foot forward, to be a change maker in the world, not a country that goes out and through neocolonialism and through our economic interests destabilizes regions and hurts millions of people. So for me, when I look at what's going on, I look at our US defense budget. Our Army, we have the strongest military on planet Earth. We spent in fiscal year 2018, $649 billion on our defense. $649 billion. Our allies combined and our friends, China, Saudi Arabia, India, France, Russia, England, Germany combined spent $609 billion. So the question is, what are we doing with our federal budget where half of our discretionary money goes into the military? Half goes into buying bombs, into aircraft carriers, goes into aid to places around the world where our aid is actually used in oppressions of minorities. Who are we fighting? Aliens? $649 billion? It makes absolutely no logical sense. We have millions of people in this country who are homeless, millions who don't have access to health care, millions who are in economic debt, who have no hope of moving up in the ladder in our economy. Yet we spend billions upon billions of dollars on weapons of war when we can be putting that money to global diplomacy, into aid, in developing nations across the world, opening new markets, building alliances and friendships. And for me, when I look at our foreign policy, we have been a bad actor for a very long time. And we need to be a good neighbor and a good steward of the resources and the riches that we have in this country and use that for the good, for global development. And for me, when I see Senator Sanders, I see an individual who is thinking about foreign policy and global diplomacy in a very different way. He doesn't see other countries as adversaries. He sees them as potential allies and partners in development, in trade, in education, in science, and in art. And for us as people in this country, whether you are Republican or Democrat or independent, whether you don't care about politics, what we do need to do is be mindful of our role in the world, to be actors for good, to build partnerships, and to be good stewards in the global community. And right now, our State Department has a lot of capacity to do that, but it requires policy that is focused on human rights, on global development, and on building community. Right now, 18% of our foreign service positions, foreign service officer jobs across the world, these individuals who are meant to go out and build relationships with foreign governments, with communities, are vacant. These jobs are vacant. And we've cut our budget on diplomacy, and we put more money year after year into buying bombs. And for me, that's an equation that's going to lead to disaster. And for us as a nation, we need to put more resources into building alliances. We need to be willing to let go of our egos, willing to let go of our relationships in the past and look towards the future. What can we do to solve the problems of the world? And they're only going to expand. For example, climate change is not only affecting Iowans farmers on the Missouri and Mississippi with flooding, with droughts. But it's also affecting millions of people around the world. In India, where in Hyderabad they had water wars this year, where the poor residents were in the streets protesting because they did not have access to clean water. That leads to violence, that leads to migration, and that leads to more individuals seeking asylum. And let me tell you, as a refugee, my mother did not want to leave her homeland. She did not want to uproot herself and leave a country she was born in, a language she understood, and a culture she was able to operate in, to come to a foreign land and struggle. She would have preferred to stay in her homeland. And I will tell you, a majority of people around the world prefer to be at home. And what we as a country need to do is be willing to step up and help solve some of those problems, some of them which we are responsible for. So we have to look at the crises of the world, whether it's climate change, whether it's economies collapsing, whether it's our foreign domestic policy, and look at them as intersectional issues. They are not mutually exclusive. And we need to have foreign policy and domestic policy moving forward that looks to the world as partnership opportunities, as development opportunities, not crises after crises, not going out there and making enemies of old friends and blocking new relationships. So for me, it's about creating a world where we can work together, and also being responsible as Americans, and making sure that the United States Congress does its job, to make sure that our executive department does its job. We've been at war for a very long time, but Congress has never declared war since World War II. That's a failure on our part. And we need to be active stewards of our Constitution, and we need to be good players on the world stage. And I want to open this up to you. You know, I have a lot of things I can say, but I want to hear what your thoughts are. I want to hear what you care about and some of the issues that you want some answers on. Thank you.
It has been said that many Americans are supporting candidates out of fear. What do you think, or have you learned, that they are afraid of?
Well, that's a tough one. Yeah. So fear is a tool used by many when they don't have an agenda for the future. They play to the insecurities and the fears of people, whether it's economic security, physical safety, global security. And for a lot of people, whether you're brown, black, Asian, whatever you are, whether you're young or old, we care about the same things. We want to have a good life. We want to have access to health care. We want to live in a clean environment. And we want to live in a society where we have the potential to make better things for ourselves and for our future and for our children. And a lot of people are playing on the fears of economic stagnation, of immigrants coming in and taking your jobs, of people coming from other places to harm you. And, you know, a lot of those things, you know, they go to the innate nature of human psychology, and they're very powerful. But what's more powerful is a message of hope, a message of unity, of solidarity, of an actual plan to move our society forward. And we have to be mindful that there are people who are going to play to the fears. But if someone is playing to your fears, they have an ulterior motive. I would look towards the people who have an inspiring message of change, for the future, for the better things. Don't listen to people who want to divide, right? Listen to those who want to build commonality and community between people in this country and with people around the world.
I think this is a good follow-up to that one. It says, old folks vote, why don't the young folks?
That's very, very true, but you'll be in for a surprise this caucus. You're going to see a lot of things changing. We, as a campaign, have been putting substantial resources into working with our current electorate, but we understand how important it is to expand the electorate. Some of the reasons that we're dealing with in this country is because we have the same people voting time and time again, right? And those at the bottom of our economic strata young people, people of color, new immigrants who still feel like they're guests in this country, even though they're citizens. They have something very valuable to bring to the table. They understand the difficulties of life, and they understand what policies actually do to people. Immigrants understand an unjust foreign policy leads to death. It leads to migration. And I think they're very important because they're going to come in and change the electorate. So this year, I don't know what other campaigns are doing, but the Sanders campaign has been putting substantial resources into making sure young people show up. And also this year, 17-year-olds who will be turning 18 by the November election will be flooding your caucuses. So watch out. Change is coming, so.
Supporters of the current administration in Washington say, we can't just throw open our border and let everybody in. What do you say to such people?
I think every person in this country, whether you voted for candidate X or candidate Y, whether you're Democrat, conservative, liberal, socialist, or the People's Republic of Johnson County, right? I think everyone cares about the same issues. I think they have humanity deeply rooted in them, and they're caring. But through fear, through lack of education on these issues, people take advantage of the American people, and it's been happening for far too long. Even the well-educated somehow fall into a malaise after watching a couple hours of news programs. And what I say to them is, don't fear people who don't look like you, right? If you're a religious person, open up the scriptures and you'll see stories of brotherhood, of community, of welcoming the stranger. If you are concerned about economic realities, listen, a person who's traveling 2,000 miles from South America to the United States border is interested in hard work. They're interested in changing their lives and making opportunities for their children. We need people like that in this country. Let me tell you, I'm not that hard of a worker. I'm kind of lazy sometimes. But immigrants, when they come in, they expand our economy. They start new businesses. When you look at the group of people in this country who have the highest level of educational attainment are Nigerian immigrants. They're not from South Korea, they're not from South Bend, they're not from Los Angeles. They're immigrants who are coming here, who are becoming doctors, who are opening businesses, who are becoming part of American society. And as a country, we need to build and expand. And I know it's tough, but sometimes all you got to do is just walk across the street and say hello to somebody that doesn't look like you. And you'll find you have more in common. And I will say is I've been traveling across Iowa, this ultra-liberal young African immigrant, and I've been talking to old white farmers who are Republicans. And let me tell you, I have a great time talking with them because after that strange first encounter and you start talking to each other as human beings, you find you have so much in common. And you care about the same things and you're supporting the same sports teams, right? And it's about building community. I know there's a lot of fear and a lot of people who are going to traffic in that to win your vote. But I would say is be courageous. Be willing to talk to people that don't look like you. And be willing to open your heart to strangers. And I think you'll be surprised by how much you gain personally from that.
Follow up a little on that last answer too. Mexico and Central America, what should the U.S. be doing to improve lives of people in these neighboring countries to the south to reduce immigration from violence and poverty?
I think it's a multifaceted approach. There's no one single answer to these. As a country, we need to stand up and support democratic movements, support governments in these Latin American countries in developing best practices. We need to be kind, considerate neighbors. And when people are flinging themselves at our border asking for protection, we don't have to change the laws. We just need to follow the laws on the books, right? We need to give these people asylum hearings, which we're not doing. But most importantly, we need to stop our bad faith efforts in these countries. We need to stop overthrowing nations and installing dictatorships. We need to hold our corporations accountable for the pollution that they're doing in these countries because they can't get away with it here. We need to make sure that we are not abusing workers in those countries where we have U.S. corporations going in and making people work for nothing. And we need to be investing in these countries, right? We can only solve problems by solving the problems, not the symptoms. Immigration crisis is a symptom of a greater problem. If we keep throwing Band-Aids at the symptom, we're never going to stop it. We have to make life better for people around the world. And that starts by, investing in the people, having economic aid and working with people, stopping gang violence in places like El Salvador, and being good neighbors. And we need to stop being bullies. That's what we need to do.
I think this next question relates to your discussion about the military budget. It says, I have not heard any candidate discussing the expanding deficit. Could you comment on that?
Deficit. Okay. Yeah, this is a problem that starts every 4 years. If a certain party is in power, we hear all about the deficit. And if another party is in power, it doesn't exist, right? But it's a problem we need to be looking at. And we are spending money we don't have to buy bombs and planes to attack enemies that don't exist. That's a problem, right? We're spending money we don't have to buy bombs and planes to attack enemies that don't exist. And for us, we need to really look at the biggest chunk of money in our discretionary budget is going towards the military. I think if you take a small chunk of that, you throw it at the State Department, you throw it at international development and aid, you're going to see a lot of the problems that you are having are going to disappear. And we as a country also need to look at how we're taxing each other, right? I know what my tax bracket is, and I've seen reports of what the wealthiest in this country are paying and the wealthiest corporations are paying. There's an inequity there. We can solve our deficit problem by really looking at taxation, by looking at how we're spending money, how we're borrowing money, and how we're expanding our economy. And it's not an easy problem to fix. There's no panacea for it. It's going to take hard work, and it's going to take years to solve these problems. But we have to come at it from a position of goodwill and actually caring about solving the problems and not throwing partisan politics into the mix. We have to start acting as one community in this country, because we have a system where one party comes into power, runs amok, leaves a mess, and then blames it on the next person coming in, and it's repeated time and time again. So we just have to start acting like adults. That's what I'm going to say.
If we have a new U.S. president willing to take some responsibility for refugees, is there any NGO plan to help in Syria? And I would expand that to other countries where we're seeing a lot of violence.
I can't speak specifically to programs or things that are going to come, but what I will say is, the first part of the question?
Syria, is there an NGO plan to help Syria? And will a new U.S. president be willing to take some responsibility for it?
First of all, like I said, my mom didn't want to come to the United States. She wanted to live in her home country where she's from, and she was forced out, right? She was forced out of her homeland because of violence. And I think what you're seeing in Syria is a brutal dictatorship. You're seeing multinational groups coming in, the U.S., Russia, and all these different allies, Turkey, causing violence. And I think we need to stop worrying about, do refugees want to come here, to talking about how can we make life habitable and livable where they're from? How do we make sure that they have opportunities for economic development? How do we make sure that they live in safe communities? And I think a lot of those problems are going to be solved. But one thing I will say is a lot of the people that are running today in the Democratic field actually care about people. They care about people and the difficulties of people around the world. And I can speak directly about my candidate is someone who sees everyone as his brother and sister, whether they're American or not, and has a big heart and wants to take care of people and make sure that they're safe. So I will say any new administration that comes in is going to be a lot better than what we have today. But we shouldn't be just happy with, direction, change, and something good. We should be shooting for the moon. We should be shooting for the best possible outcome a presidency where we're actually going to care about people in this country and also care about people around the world. It's hard for hate to be harbored amongst people when you actually try to build bridges and community across the pond and across state lines. So.
You mentioned political, economic, and religious refugees, but did not elaborate on the increasing number of environmental refugees. Could you please comment? These numbers soon may outgrow all other refugees. What do you suggest to work to halt climate change and environmental degradation?
So yeah, a lot of refugees today are refugees because of religious violence, political violence, and economic realities. But those numbers are going to just exponentially explode because of climate change. Most of the world's population lives by the sea level, right? We have water wars happening in India. We've had floods that happened in southern Somalia. My good friend just came back from there and just saw the absolute devastation. And we see communities that are hit with floods and then are hit with droughts. Hit with floods and hit with droughts. And for us as a nation and as a world, we need to make dramatic change. You know, scientists are telling us we have less than 11 years to get our act together. And for me, we need a Green New Deal and a Green New Economy where we're no longer pumping millions and billions of particles of carbon into the air, where we're actually using the technology in place today to redesign our transportation system, our energy infrastructure. And it actually will save you money, so it's going to help with the deficit. So it solves a lot of different problems, right? It solves global immigration issues, it solves our deficit, and it solves the immorality of our country harming the world. And usually we don't see that ourselves, but we're increasingly seeing that. But it affects millions of people around the world in very devastating ways.
Okay, we're going to really put you on the spot with this one. Do you think the people of Iowa should be the first caucus in the country? And if so, why do you believe this?
I will say that's a tough one. That's a tough one. There's people on both sides, right? And for me, you know, there's legitimate concerns for people that our country's demographic is quickly changing. We have a younger country. We have more people of color in this nation. We have so much regional diversity that has to be taken into account. But I also happen to think that the people of Iowa are very good people. They care about human rights, right? Iowa, for people that don't know, it's a very progressive state. Iowa desegregated before the rest of this country, right? When we were looking at slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act, Iowa was one of the first states in the country to say, this is not going to happen here, right? And I happen to think that Iowa has a very long history and tradition of taking elections very seriously. And it's kind of actually frustrating as a campaign staffer. I have friends that work in other states, and they'll call people and yep, I know who I'm supporting. But when you call Iowans, they say, I don't know yet. I haven't met them all. So Iowans have a very unique place in this country where you actually get the chance to have intimate conversations with every single candidate, because they know that in order to win, ads don't work here and mailers don't work here. You actually have to show up and talk to the people, and you have to show your worth. So I think there are valid concerns for, looking at who's first in the nation and how that plays a role. But I think Iowa has been very good stewards of this caucus process. And personally, as Abshir, I think Iowa's okay to stay first in the nation.
Iowa City has been unable to solve the problem of affordable housing. Why suppose that as a nation we can play a major role in solving the problems of, say, Honduras, for example?
Housing. Yeah, housing is a very important issue, and our campaign recently, Senator Sanders and Congressman Omar came out with a plan to solve housing, right? We need a green new housing as well. And for a lot of people around the world, they struggle with, having a home. And for my family in particular, we lived in a tent in the desert for 4.5 years, and we understand what that's like and how that affects your health outcomes, how that affects your educational attainment. And for us as a nation, we have a moral responsibility. We are the richest country in the history of the world. We have more resources than have ever been amassed in world history. And yet we have hundreds of thousands of people sleeping on the streets. So we as a country need to change that, and we have to build sustainable housing for people. It's a moral issue. It's a human rights issue. But we also have to be mindful of how we use our aid dollars overseas. I personally think we need to sell less bombs and guns to countries and help them build more housing and schools and hospitals. I think that's going to be more important for global stability and peace than providing Saudi Arabia arms. Yeah.
Okay. I love this last question. Do you have political plans in your future? Oh. And it goes on to say, if not, you should! Exclamation point, exclamation point. Thank you for your realistic assessment of the world. So.
Thank you. All right, so I'm not running for president, but what I will say is, for me and for all of us, we care about our communities and we care about where we're heading as a nation. And we see the people in power today have very vested interests. We see how they raise money for their campaigns. We see what types of bills and issues they support. And a lot of that doesn't sit right with me. So for us as people, we just can't complain and nag and whine. We actually have to step up and be part of the problem, whether it is being part of your school PTA and demanding a program of inclusion and equity, whether it's being part of your parks board, making sure that we have green spaces in our cities, whether it's you're running for mayor and making sure that you're holding your police departments accountable and your city servants in line, or whether you want to write the laws in this country. It's important for everyday people like you and I to be in power and to run and to change narratives. And for me, I had the astute honor of meeting Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a couple weeks ago when she came to Iowa. And when I saw her, I saw someone who was humble, who was kind, and who gave a damn about the world, right? And she put that energy into her community, and she won, and we see that she's doing tremendous things. Imagine if Iowa sent 4 AOCs to Congress, right? Imagine if we had a state legislature filled with people who cared about humanity, who cared about the working class, who cared about changing society. So if I have a role in the future and I can help, absolutely. But I'm busy for the next year electing the next president of the United States. So.
So with that, we conclude our program, and I want to give a great big thank you to Abshir Omar for his wonderful presentation and stepping in at the last minute to help us out. So thank you again. I also want to thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization for their generous support. And we also thank today's special sponsors, Alice and Ken Atkinson, Alan Swanson of Bank and McCune Realtors, Green State Credit Union, and also City Channel 4 for making our programs available to viewing audiences. Abshir, as a small token of our appreciation, we want to present you with the highly coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug, that's what I'm trying to say, so that you can carry it with you, and when you get elected to your next big office, you can have it there. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you. I do have a caffeine addiction, so this is going to help a lot. Thank you all.